Welcome back, everyone, to the Human Cell Atlas Asia 2021 meeting. We're in our final session now, and really the discussion that I'm posing to the rest of the organising committee here is how do we really capitalise on the wins of the Human Cell Atlas and what's next for HCA Asia. And so I'm going to start actually by throwing over to Al and just asking Al, in terms of HCA First Draft, do you think that that first draft has really properly encapsulated the work and the people of our region?
I'm probably not the right person to talk about it. I mean, I think if you look at the ethnicity of or the genotype of the samples that have been collected and published to date, the vast majority is of European origins. We heard earlier today from Partha, and you know about this from the equity discussions. I think ADA is doing a great job. It's a fantastic model for collaboration and reaching out to communities across Asia. And this is part of the reason Australia's reaching out. We want to work together. We think we're all part of the same world. We're all part of the same time zone. Let's work together. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think ADA is actually a really great place to start this discussion because, Cheyenne, it's been a real triumph of how the region can network and work together, and it was lovely seeing results coming out of your preliminary studies. So perhaps the next question is, how do others in the region participate in your immune cell atlas, in your ADA atlas?
Thanks for the kind words, Christine. People who would like to join AIDA, we welcome them. AIDA started with just 3 countries, South Korea, Japan, Singapore. And it was through these kinds of conversations at HCA meetings that, so I met Bardam and Addis Ababa, and Partha also had the same meeting, actually, if I remember correctly. I met him at other meetings as well. And then they joined, and then a few more countries joined. So now we're at 8. Hope to expand even more. It's an open consortium, and we really want to profile immune diversity all over Asia. So we're just one email away. Please contact us.
So what about the other atlases that were spoken about today and perhaps might be of particular interest to the Asian region? Angela, Aki, what do you think in those regards? Which other tissues should we be focusing on next?
Aki, you want to go first?
I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Well, yeah, sure. I can kick us off. So, I mean, earlier today we also heard from Joshua, who's also in Hong Kong. And actually, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that within Hong Kong we haven't been great about collaborating across institutions. In fact, you know, he mentioned nasopharyngeal carcinoma, which is a type of cancer that is quite unique to Southeast Asia and in particular South China. And I've been working on that disease for a while. And then, you know, given that my own interest is also in multimodal characterizations, which is beneficial for cancer, you know, that's something that I had intended to discuss with Joshua after this meeting and see if we could start something. And I know also, you know, there are cases of MPC also in Singapore and several other Southeast Asian countries. So if there are others in the audience who have an interest in this particular disease, I'd be interested to discuss together. And then also, I think, you know, again, kind of based on my own work with single-cell 1-seq, we can also look at viral genomes and transcriptomes at the same time. And we've demonstrated that with MPC as an example. And so any other sorts of viral infections, we would also be super interested to start working on. So that's sort of maybe a starting point for me, and I definitely would like to get more involved with the others here.
Yeah, to follow up, maybe I'm not so sure about focusing on particular tissues, in Asia, but definitely some of the topics or themes and diseases included, such as aging, of course, is one of my obvious interests. And there are obviously, it wasn't very hard to find speakers for this as well. And so there are obviously common interests, strong interests within Asia. And I think it would be really great to form, mini consortia or mini, like the subgroups, work groups around the themes. And I think they would have several different tissues people are working on. So that could be, that's a topic of interest, I think, and or discussion, whether, Asia should actually focus on some of the tissues that might strengthen our research, or would it be certain sort of observations, biological observations, of obviously like inflammation? Are we just going to focus on inflammation, or inflammation is done so much? Should we focus on non-inflammatory aspects in Asia, for example, to find a sort of a strength that we can actually work on? No, I think it's up for discussion. Yeah, that we should have.
Yeah, if I can contribute, add a bit to that. So, thanks to Shyam's effort and Wunyang and myself, who are part of the AIDA, it kind of thought really hard about what makes AIDA quite unique and effective. Is first, the sample accessibility is pretty easy, so it is one of the attractive model to work for. But second aspect is, are we able to do something that we cannot do locally? Because if any of the project that we've heard in the last 2 days can be done by your own institution, it will be done, and it will be done really well. And such data could be deposited into DCP, and we should all encourage that kind of activity. So the question that we should be asking is, what can we do as a region, as a Asia, that we cannot do alone? And genetics and ancestry is something that we cannot do by a single country, and that we need a regional support. And AIDA is a great example of putting people together, because we are looking at EQTLs and genetic diversity using immune cells. So we have to think about what are the tissues that are easily accessible, and second, what are some of the ancestral questions that we can ask. And the third is perhaps environment. And the last session that Kristen, you just chaired, is an excellent example of how different environment can influence our health and disease. And that could be either diet, microbiome, to air pollution. Now, all of these questions could only be answered through regional aspects, and a single local country cannot do this. So if you're talking about microbiome of the skin, or a microbiome of the gut, could be a little bit challenging to access samples, but different diets are very prevalent, and even air pollution, and if you can have access to some lung tissues. And these do not have to be genetic scale. They don't have to be hundreds of samples, but if you're able to collect various samples from different regions, I think that's kind of be very motivating, and it requires a regional effort. So I think we should aim towards that kind of project.
I think that's really important. Thanks, Jay. And, to expand on that a little bit further, is it possible really to have an immune cell atlas, a healthy immune cell atlas, without understanding what those environmental pressures are that shape immune training, be it the microbiota, or immune responses, be it endemic diseases? And it feels a little bit artificial to separate those just for the host aspects when there is an opportunity, and perhaps even an urgency, to be capturing some of the pathogen questions at the same time. That might take us a little bit away from the original goals of the Human Cell Atlas, though. So how do we address that as a particular importance to this region? How do we move it forward?
Is that the question for me, or maybe others
Question
can
to the
answer
panel,
that?
but
Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay.
Well, so regarding pathogen, again, I think there were in your session has been a very great commonality in identifying pathogens. So I think so when we talk about pathogen, it really depends on a very variety of pathogens, and it's hard, I think, to create a single consortium on a single pathogen, multiple pathogens. So in a way, there needs to be a lot of communication about. So I'm not an immunologist expert, so I can't really say. So what would be a great way to structure such consortium? But is there a way to identify common interest, even a common disease that would attract people to engage in? Or if it's too thinly spread, maybe it loses the mission or the direction, and no one will be interested in engaging. So it becomes more of an organizational question, and also leadership, I think, is also important. So if there is a will, there's a way, right? So hopefully there'll be through these last two meetings, some of the leaders will be inspired to bring people together, have a common interest, and lead it. And I think Shyam has been an excellent role model, and he's leading the IDA project. So we need another Shyam leading different aspects of pathology to microbiome. And I think we've seen few candidates. So I'm very excited how it's going to expand.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there are some really fantastic emerging leaders in the region in that space. And I actually do think that the microbial world will become, I guess, another mode to the host immune system. It's not necessarily being all-encompassing about these different microbial species, but rather making sure that it's an additional dimension to the data that we're collecting. Aki, please go ahead.
I was actually just going to make exactly that point, that we know there was, I don't remember, is it 10 times more or 5 times more number of microbes in our body, right? And we're also seeing from our data sets that if you don't have, microbes at least in the mouse model, the immune state, immune profile is very different. And so they're obviously having a huge effect on our everyday life, and in a good way as well, I'm sure. So when we talk about the healthy profiling of the immune cells, I do think it will be important to take this kind of modality as well into account, because if you have different microbes in your body, your immune profile will be different too. So I think it will be, something that we will naturally become to do. But, we could actually be, the leader in this area we can consider in Asia, actually, is one way of looking at it.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess this other question, something that Angela touched on, is that even within a single city, it can be hard to network and communicate with people who have common interests. And if we're really wanting to drive the next generation of ADA or the next generation of whatever the new tissue atlas will be, how do we organise ourselves to make that networking easier? I mean, in one way, COVID has really worked against us here, because the conversations that you might have face-to-face are much more artificial in a Zoom environment. So are there things that we could do to facilitate people coming together and to encourage and foster the next generation leaders in our region? Shyam, would you like to comment on this, or do you have something to add to the previous discussion?
Sorry, I was going to bring up a different point actually, but maybe we'll continue with what you were asking, and I can bring that up. Or maybe Al can, I think Al wants to respond to what you brought up. So let him go.
I think, and we come back to this old cherry every time. It's the price of entry. So I think we need to fundamentally reduce the cost of these assays, and that really does hurt collaborations in low-income countries. I think over the past few years, it's been actually great for bilateral collaboration. Lots and lots of bilateral collaborations, but the multilateral ones are hard to get off the ground because they require big money. And I'm just sort of wondering if some sort of rules of collaboration / engagement, so like generosity of collaboration, generosity of spirit, we want to work to, so for example, for ADA, I think it is very, very open. So if you've got collaborators who potentially come to you and they say they've got a handful of PBMC samples from their particular group, are they welcome with open arms? And I think if you can, that would be great. If people continue to add to this bigger thing. But the multilateral collaborations, they really need money. They need big money. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents.
And go ahead, Cheyenne.
Al raises an excellent point. I wanted to chip in with what our experience has been, so that maybe the next IDA can benefit from that experience. And there has to be a next IDA. IDA cannot be the full stop at the end of our HCA projects. Right? There should be others. What we found is that it's fine. Like Vardham's example is very nice, right? He said he got international funding before he got local funding, right? So the only prerequisite was he needed to show that he could do the single cell assay, and then CZI were willing to fund him, and also existing consortia like IDA, they can get top-up funding to add, every once in a while they can get top-up funding to add new teams, even if it's like Al said, if it's for a small number of samples. In fact, that's even easier to get top-up funding for that. And then once this new team has gotten that funding, it's easier for them to leverage that, as Vardhan did, to get more local funding, and then pitch to CZI or anyone else for even larger funding. So I think there's one can go up gradually. One doesn't have to come from zero and go to a massive cohort and a massive project all at once. So I think it's quite feasible. So certainly for us, the experience from IDA was that if you have a bunch of committed people who, actively, sincerely working together, so that then the money will come. We formed our collaboration before we had any funds for it, and then we applied for the grant. And I think others will have a similar experience. I don't think the funds are that limiting, particularly for consortia like ours that have a focus on diversity. Because diversity is usually lacking. The whole world knows we need it, and they're just looking for qualified teams who can, carry the ball and run with it. I really feel this is our opportunity, and I really want to emphasize, I don't think funding is that limiting. It's that we just have to show capability and willingness, at least in the diversity space. If we're doing something that has nothing to do with diversity, then I think the funding, we have to think of some other modes of funding.
So there are two parallel conversations here which are really very tightly intertwined. The first is understanding who's in your space that wants to work with you. And one thing the Human Cell Atlas has done really beautifully, more broadly, is helped coalesce these special interest groups. HCA Asia being an example of one of those. The organoid group and the developmental group being other examples, and perhaps we might think that a HCA aging or a HCA post-immune response are the next cabs off the rank, in which case we should be able to draw on the infrastructure of the HCA to help pull people together. So here's an invitation. If you are listening to this and you're really passionate about one of these areas, you see yourself leading it, you see yourself contributing it, contact me, contact Al, contact anyone on this panel, and we'll hook you up with that infrastructure and get the ball rolling. I think then the second question of how do you get the money and how do you get the know-how requires not just generosity of spirit, as Al has suggested, but it requires sponsors, it requires mentors, it requires people who are willing to stand up and say, yeah, I'm going to help you get training. And again, looking at the example that Pompan and Varadin spoke about, where Sarah and her group in Cambridge were very generous in providing training and support to the Thai people, to those Thai labs, really made a big difference to get them up and running. And so again, part of that network might be for those of us who are more established, being prepared to be the sponsors and the trainers. And I can promise you there are plenty of opportunities and plenty of people willing to do that here. I guess the third aspect, coming back to this question of what is it that we know how to do really well, is the fact that many of the smaller labs, which might have been starting to focus on human cell atlas, have had to pivot back to pathogen testing for COVID. That's happened for quite a few of the laboratories across Indonesia, Thailand, Bangladesh, and so on, Vietnam. So perhaps we need to be building on that expertise and using that as a strength to move into some of these questions of post-pathogen interactions. So if you're running one of those labs, maybe you're going to be the lead of one of these next activities. So I'd like to turn Jay, go ahead.
Just want to add, kind of to put it into more practical terms, I think spatial transcriptomics have been, I think at the right time to actually look into host pathogen, even ability for a lot of labs to store samples. They have access to a lot of clinical samples, and you don't really need fancy, say, you just need something to slice your sections. Of course, the Visium technology is expensive. Nonetheless, the samples are quite accessible. I would say far more than if you want to do any single cell dissociation in RNA sequencing. So I think that is also an opportunity where spatial transcriptomics have matured enough that even many countries, even low-income countries, can contribute and participate. So hopefully that can be a call for next phase of collaboration that can start in Asia.
Thanks, Jay. I think that's a great segue into this question of what technologies are going to drive us into realising these ambitions. And Quan, I think would be appropriate to ask you to comment in this area as well.
Yeah, thanks. I just like to second Jay. That's for spatial transcriptomics. Now samples can be fixed and sent across countries quite easily. For example, we've been working with COVID-19 and we got sample from Brazil. So that's intercontinental exchange of the sample. So within the region, I think it's quite feasible for many countries to share the samples and include all the diversity aspect. That I think is crucial. About the technology, before talking about future technology, I like to also mention about the capacity in the region. Like even with the single cell technology that is very well established from the talk that Nam and other mentioned today, that for example in Vietnam they really need some training and some capacity building. the enthusiasm is there, and they even have the resource to run some experiments. But yeah, training is crucial. And I think for the immune and infectious disease, I think it's also something very unique for the region, because many tropical countries, there's many unique infectious disease types, like malaria is really common in many countries like Vietnam, India, and Indonesia. So I think it's really something that maybe, yeah, I hope that the next IDA will be something like that, that we something that's unique for the region. Yeah, so the technology like spatial transcriptomics, as Jay mentioned, is expensive, but in return, it doesn't require any special equipment. And for some pilot study, I think many countries can afford it. Yeah, so it's just some of my ideas, and happy to hand over to others in the panel.
Technology access can be a challenge for some of the low to middle income countries. And if there isn't a big market there, then access to fresh reagents and so forth can be challenging as well. So maybe this is an opportunity for the spatial technology vendors to open up an untapped market and really help us drive a new dimension to the Human Cell Atlas here locally. So clearly we heard of some desire to not just use existing technology, but to develop new capabilities for that technology. And we heard Ash talk about wanting to sequence, for example, T-cell receptor recombination events in a spatial manner, or to add in some of the multi-omics on top of the spatial. So I'm just wondering, you know, where do you see that going in the region, both in terms of creating the know-how to get the data and then in the data integration? And I wonder if I can throw to Jess around that question.
Thanks, Christine. I mean, I think data generation is obviously a really important factor. But I think if we think about scalable capacity, right, I think training people to do data science, to analyze these data sets, to develop expertise, I think that's incredibly portable and able to be done, you know, even virtually. I think COVID's taught us that, you know, it is possible to do these sorts of collaborations, even though they are far more fun to do in person. And, you know, there's obviously many examples, and we have, you know, RIKEN and RIKEN alumni here that speak to the success of how these international consortia can go. And I think perhaps that's a space where perhaps people can come together. And there are many, you know, hungry, enthusiastic bioinformaticians out there who are also keen to train, sponsor, and guide others too. And I think that creates a skill set that is really, I think, a really great asset for improving everything that we generate, right, in terms of the data. So that would be certainly my plug. It's not really a technology, but I think it's a competency that we can really grow within HCA Asia.
I don't think you can have one grow without the other, actually. So
yeah, absolutely. I think that's where the sweet spot is, to have the data, the people in the data generation with the people who have the scientific questions and the people who are bringing all those together to address them with the data.
Thank you. And that's, you know, I do agree with you that one of the highlights of the meeting has been this focus on aging and our capability to do longitudinal studies. And I'm just wondering if you, and Asia seems to be a really important part of the world to understanding healthy aging. And I'm wondering if you would like to comment on that as an opportunity for an Asia dimension to an atlas. Aki?
Sorry, I didn't hear my name. Yeah, I do also feel that could be one of Asia's strengths. I mean, of course, Asia is not the only regions that are known to have people who live beyond 100 and things, but there's also some blue zones that we can actually select, and in addition to standard sort of healthy aging. So yeah, I'm actually have been feeling during this meeting whether it would be a good idea to form some kind of group around aging for those who are interested in getting together and pushing it together, and just really discuss beyond. And of course, the samples is something that we can have leverage on, who might live longer than on average. We already have some contacts with also with Piero as well, a group at Keio University who have been studying centenarians and super centenarians. They have amazing contacts with them who are actually willing to give samples. And some people may know that Piero published some research on PBMC, single cell RNA-seq, on super centenarians, and this is really amazing stuff. And we were able to go to their houses and collect blood and do the experiments, and we may be able to form this kind of thing in several different countries that are in different environments. Of course, we talked about the effect of the environment, diet and everything, and all of these, integrating all these aspects of course is critical in understanding what makes prolonged healthy aging, which we're all interested in, of course. So yeah, I just felt there is a good, a lot of good things to get together on. And so yeah, if anybody's interested in this idea, even just for a casual, chat about how we can push this and form potential group, please email me. And we also talked about casually amongst these members before about whether it would, if I could bring this up, Christine, about forming possibly a wiki or some sort of site where we can share our interests. And if there is enough bodies of interest, we can get together and form groups to work on and see what unique aspects we can, bring to the world. And get together, and then that could be also beginning point of seeking for funding, additional funding. Again, what Jay was talking about earlier, what something one country or one group cannot do, by getting together across Asia, and then being more inclusive of more countries. Maybe those people, groups who are not able to get substantial funding on their own, together we can actually go and get that. So yeah, I think it will be great. And I just feel like there's enough cohesiveness within the Asian teams here that is not too big, that is not too out of control, and people really have interest to work together. As Shyam said, I think is very critical. People care about working together, and it's just not out of hand yet. It's cohesive enough. I think we can, we come together and do something great. So yeah, I've been feeling just great spirit throughout the meeting. So it would be great to carry that to the next phase.
I agree entirely again. And Al, this is something that you were speaking about as well, and even just the idea of having a mailing list across the HCA Asia delegates to start this conversation and start forming some of these groups. So do you want to elaborate at all on that?
Yeah, I think several of you have been involved in the Phantom projects. One thing we did is we had a mailing list. We also had a wiki, and the wiki was actually like a declaration of we're going to work on a paper in this space or that space, and it actually led to collaborations. People saw what other people were working on and thought, oh, that's really cool. I can contribute to that. So I think sort of more openness, and it's not because we're not hiding stuff, it's just that we don't have a mechanism for sharing it other than we see someone present, we reach out to them and say, do you want to work together? But actually having a formal wiki or website where we can actually do this would be great. I'm very much in favour.
I just want to second that, but also at the same time want to say we do have an HCA Asia Slack channel. So if you are in the Human Cell Atlas Slack workspace, you can actually join the HCA-Asia channel. So I don't, this should be in addition to wiki or website, because Slack sometimes serves different purpose, but it may also be a great way to introduce yourself or introduce your ideas. So please join Slack, HCA Asia.
All right, so as we wrap up this conversation, I think the last question to ask each of you is, where will we be in 5 years as a community? I'm going to point the microphone at each of you just for a quick sound grab, but I'm going to start with Jess. 5 years.
Wow, thanks for letting me be the first off the rank. So one thing that really struck me today in my session was how different people were studying cancers that were relevant to their specific Asian population. And it was interesting because someone made a comment that those cancers were considered rare cancers in the rest of the world. So 5 years from now, I think I would love to see the Human Cell Atlas Asia be so successful that those cancers are no longer considered rare, because we will have figured out all these sorts of things with the resources that we generate. So that's where I think we'll be.
Brilliant. And that leads me on clearly to Angela. Angela, 5 years from now?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Jess said. And I think even for me, that wasn't apparent until I moved back to Asia from the US, and then realized that people were working on completely different problems here sometimes. So I think, 5 years from now, I'm hoping that we can have more representation on the global scale. When I go to conferences nowadays, for single cell or otherwise, I still feel like it's dominated by researchers outside of Asia. We always have the same couple of big names from Asia presenting their work. And I'm just hoping that with the efforts of HCA Asia, we'll have more representation. And in particular, because I'm still considered a junior investigator, I hope that we'll also see more junior investigators from Asia being able to showcase their work, especially from developing regions that, we've heard some incredible stuff today. And yeah, I hope to see them more on the global stage.
Thanks so much, Angela. Kwan.
Yeah, so 5 years from now, I like to see almost all Asian countries in this kind of meeting. I like to see Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, and more. And I also like to see, from the computational point of view, I like to see how best we can use the global HCA data, integrate it into the Asia data, so we can do some kind of transfer learning, using what known to inform what we want to discover in our region.
Thank you. Diane?
Sorry, was that me, Christine?
It was.
Okay, thank you. Didn't hear you clearly. Rather than say where we will be in 5 years, I'll say where I would love to see us in 5 years, if we can do it right. And this is responding to Angela, really. So I agree with her completely that so each part of the world has its own ecosystem. Okay, so Europe has its ecosystem, North America has its scientific ecosystem, and we're geographically just far away. Okay, so it'll always be hard, even all other factors being equal, it'll be hard for us to be fully part of those ecosystems. We're just far away. We need to build our own. So that's where I'd like to see us in 5 years, where we have our own rich, vibrant, Asia-based or Asia-Pacific-based research ecosystem that we have built in collaboration with each other and building our own institutions, our own consortia, our own projects. And then other people will be asking us if they can join us, rather than us asking them if we can join theirs.
Love that. Aki?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with everything that's been said. So I won't say the same thing. The one thing I got really, I think, influenced by your also session, Christine, and this idea of including it's more technological aspects, but including the microbiome data in the same, because I've also heard some talks that within our, we already probably have these data, so it's about mining the microbe or the viral aspects from the sequencing files that we already have. So it'll be, I think, great to know if this becomes like a more of a norm in 5 years' time, to be able to look at that and integrate and sort of make more sense about why we see differences. Can it be attributed to those things at least? Yeah. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jane.
Well, it's hard if you're going towards the end of this session. There's been so many good comments being raised, and I agree 100%. I would love to see two things. Maybe one is more all the talks in 5 years will be like AIDA-like talks, where all these collaborative talks will be presented. I mean, past 2 days were excellent research being done in the area, but just hope to see more collaborative talks being presented and just sharing their experiences. And the second thing I would love to see will be, and this is probably harder goal, is more centralized funding schemes that are structured just in the region, and being able to support more equitably across the region. And there are a lot of dialogues between funders across different countries and being able to support out of this collaborative project. So hopefully there'll be more of a not only scientific improvement, but more of a political synergy to really bring science forward. So love to see that. Thanks.
No.
And I completely agree with Sham and Jay. I mean, I think the vision of a collaborative ecosystem where we're sharing students and postdocs across Asia Pacific, I think giving future opportunities for all of our young upcoming researchers is really important. I also think that the technology and the data sets will get to a point where they become a lot cheaper. They need to become cheaper, and they'll be brought out into clinically relevant tests. So yeah, I think it's a great future. Cheers.
To sum up, I think the one thing that stuck with me from this meeting was the quality of the early career researchers who spoke. Just the depth of knowledge in their systems and the innovation that they were bringing to the table in terms of multimodal approaches, in terms of really thinking deeply about their biology. So 5 years' time, guys, I want to be sitting in the audience and listening to you driving the atlases that you're leading. And yeah, I'm looking at the guys who are in my session, Faradun, looking at you, Achia, I'm looking at you. Come on, we want to see you up here and leading your atlases. I think that's probably a good place to stop. The future is in good hands. There's a lot of exciting opportunities. We just need for someone to show us the money and we can get it done. Al, I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you for pulling together a fantastic meeting, and thanks also to the session chairs here who really programmed a really interesting and wonderful HCA Asia 2021.